Okay, well, let me tell you the simple idea of what's wrong with education. The King of Spain created a committee to reform education in Spain, and I was on the committee. And they called me and listened to me for an hour talking on the phone, and they would go, yeah, positive noises, yeah. And they said, well, if you could just say one sentence that the King of Spain would learn, what would it be? I said, eliminate all classrooms. There was dead silence on the phone. So what's wrong with school? Classrooms. And it's been that way since the Romans, at least, because in a classroom, it lends itself to something which is extremely unnatural. You sit still and shut up, and I'll yabber at you. That's not education. It is what education looks like. And then we do great technological improvements like MOOCs, which we can send out blah, blah, blah for thousands of things. It's not how we learn. You want to know how we learn? I noticed you have a child back there. That child, before it went to school, learned by trying to do stuff and every now and then needing help and saying, Dad, I need help with this. That's how we learn.
Somehow people have got this idea that education, it's the same in corporate, is about kind of force feeding people information. So you kind of sit there, I'm going to take this book and I'm going to take all this information, stick it in your head, and then you're going to be tested. And as you say, that's just not how people learn. Generally, their learn is driven by the things that they care about. And those are going to be really different. And one of the stories that I quite like when I was teaching, I used to teach psychology and used to teach a bit which is quite boring for most people, which is kind of abnormal psychology, and you trawl through stuff, and we got to bipolar disorders, and all of a sudden one student perks up and they've got a whole bunch of questions, and it turns out they have a relative who has kind of bipolar disorder, so now they want to know about it. And you kind of think, well, yeah, but for 99% of the time you're just not really addressing the things that are driving people's learning. You're just trying to force feed them stuff, and that's wrong.
And you could sit there and say to the students, well, what do you want to learn? But no one ever does that because the curriculum is written down by somebody else, and you've got to cover the material. One of my favorite things is covering the material. Really? Read a book. It's not a problem. When I was a professor, I'd walk in first day with my foot on the desk and say, so? And they'd all look at me. I said, I didn't come here to learn anything. What did you come here to learn? And they would sit there in dull, dead silence. And I said, okay, well, what are you doing here then? And then I'd get an answer about why they're in college because they want to get a degree, or about how my class was known to not be that difficult, or about how the time slot was free for them. It was never about learning. We have convinced kids that learning isn't even the issue in school.
I sometimes describe that whole process as kind of anxiety-based learning. So because I would sit with kind of kids, and if you drill down, because we would tutor some of them, it was really about their parents expected them to pass the test. Well, why was that? Well, because the test is some indicator or predictor of kind of future success, or you won't get a job if you don't pass the test. And so the problem they were trying to solve by kind of sitting there was, well, I've got to stuff all this information in my head so I pass the test, so I get a decent job, so my parents will be happy. And you think, well, that's a kind of catastrophically bad system, really. It's just all pointed in the wrong direction. But we don't start the whole process by saying, as you say, well, what do you really want to learn, and what do you really care about, and what's kind of driving this learning process, and kind of follow that in the different directions.
My favorite story about this is as I was ranting on about why lectures are stupid one day to a professor at Northwestern. He said, well, I give great lectures. I said, okay, here's the test. You walk into your classroom and there's only one student there. Do you give the lecture? He goes, I guess not, but he'd miss a great lecture.
Yeah.
You actually cannot lecture at one person, no matter how hard you try, because they will have a question and you'll have to answer it. Yeah. And it would be a conversation, which is what we're doing now. Yeah. And this conversation is not intended to produce learning. It might. You and I might come out slightly different. That happens. But it's all the way that learning is about is, I have something I'm wondering about, something I'm curious about. Who do I ask? How do we talk about this? How do I get reminded of something to learn from this, from that?
Like you, I kind of occasionally get to ask to give these presentations at conferences. And in the early days, I used to, what most people do is you kind of go with your slide deck and you've got a few points and you think, here's the key points I'm going to get across. And then people would come up to you afterwards and say, oh, I thought this point was really good. And they would all have different things that they thought you'd said. And sometimes it wasn't even something that you thought you'd said. And you kind of realize you can't do the lecture. You're just deluding yourself if you think there's a bunch of information I'm going to deliver to people and they'll all get it. Actually, what's happening is different people are picking up the different trains of thoughts and they're taking it in different directions.
I've always noted what you noted, which is that people will say, why do you believe X in the question session, when I never said X? Yeah. And I came to understand, because I work on reminding and how memory works, that every single person in the room in a lecture hall is hearing a different lecture. Yeah. And the reason they're hearing a different lecture is you've had two choices when someone talks. One, blind submission. Or 2, you think. And if you think, it means when they say something interesting, you think about it. Well, while you continue to think about it, they're going blah, 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 blah. So you haven't heard a good chunk of the lecture if you were thinking. If you were not thinking, that's worse. Yeah. So there's nobody who actually hears the lecture at all. They memorize it word for word. There are people who do that. And the rest of the people are actually having reactions and thoughts. And like I just said, you said something and caused me to tell a standard story of mine.
I like that story. It reminds me of a kind of a metaphor, which is, nobody has the same train journey. You can sit on the same train journey, but actually, if you're somebody who knows a lot about trees, your whole journey consists of, that's interesting. If you're somebody who knows a lot about kind of architecture, you have a very different train journey, and we all have different train journeys. And that's because, our learning, our kind of cognitive processes are driven by the things that concern us. So
you said, it's not just the train journey. You're picking out a larger task. A lot of times when I was a professor, I would lie down on the couch and sit there, and I'd have the secretary open the door and ping, "Oh, you have nothing to do." No, I'm doing what I do. It's called thinking. And the reality is that we don't reward thinking. We're not supposed to be doing thinking.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems with school, getting back to that. When's the thinking time?